Welcome in, everyone, to a very special episode of American Joyride. I am joined by Mike Burke. He is a former Army Ranger, and he is here to tell us a lot about a lot of different topics. I'm very excited to have him as a guest. Mike, thanks for being here.
Hey, I really appreciate you having me on, David. And it's always good to sit down with a fellow podcaster. I find that those interviews and those kind of episodes are usually the best. They're the most fun. But also, I definitely want to, just take a moment, if you don't mind. And thank you for what you're doing. There's a lot of people out there kind of recording the history of the GWOT, in the last, 30, 40 years of everything that's happened, in our country and our, Department of Defense. And, some people will say, well, there's some out there that maybe ain't doing it great. One, you're not one of those. You're doing a great job. I've listened to a lot of your episodes. I think, what you're capturing is great. But also on top of that is I would give anything to go back and be able to do that with the World War I, World War II, Korean War veterans, even the Vietnam veterans, and we could still catch some of them. But, to be able to sit down and do interviews like this, there's some out there, we've all seen the Band of Brothers and everything else, but, that's one company, that has, a TV series about it. What about all the other companies? What about the untold stories? But then also there's another aspect of it as well, is every time we do this, right, wrong, or indifferent, I don't care how anybody's doing it, we are making it more comfortable to talk about this kind of stuff and to talk about the good times, the bad times, the difficult times, all that stuff in between, which reduces stigmas. We know for a fact there's a lot of World War II, Korean War, Vietnam, and everything else, and World War I veterans that just didn't come back and talk about it. I never, there's countless uncles and grandpas and everything else that are like, they never ever told me about the war. Not one thing, and what we don't know is what was the repercussions of that. Broken families, broken spirits, lost jobs, suicides, all this different kind of stuff, because we weren't really talking about that kind of stuff back then. We're talking about it now, and we're going to prevent it from happening in the future, one episode at a time. So thank you for what you're doing.
I appreciate those incredibly kind words. That was an awesome way to open this. And I think we're going to touch on what you just said there about guys talking and opening up a little later in the interview, because that is a topic that people have varying feelings on. Is it okay to talk? Is it not okay to talk? What can we talk about? What shouldn't we talk about? Especially guys that come from your sector of the military, where you're talking Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, Delta Force, guys who see the violence, the real stuff. So we are going to get into that, and I'll be very curious to pick your brain. But before we get into that, let's rewind a little bit back to your early background. Like I said in the intro, you were an Army Ranger for a long time. How did you find yourself in the Army Rangers?
So I did have one relative that was in the military. He was also an Army Ranger, very short-lived kind of time, but what it really came down to for me is I knew I was going to do something different, because I knew staying in my hometown, which is a very, very small town, there wasn't a lot of options. There wasn't a lot of opportunities and ways to kind of, make a better life for yourself. There's nothing against, people that work on oil rigs, do, that kind of stuff, or, farming or ranching. Like, those are all things that we need. I just knew that I wanted to do more with my life. And so the military was the easiest option. I wasn't very smart. College was definitely not something that I was going to do. It took me many years to gain the maturity to be able to actually do that. So the military was the easiest option. And then on top of that, I knew if I was going to join the military, I just didn't want to do kind of the status quo thing. I wanted to do something that was, harder and better. So Ranger Regiment was that option.
What year? This is pre 9/11. You're in the Rangers before 9/11 happened. So when you get to the Rangers, obviously the GWOT changes, training, it changes the mentality. We're at war for 20 years. But when you get there, was it the late 90s?
Yeah, it was 1998. Yeah.
So when you get there in 98, was there really any idea that we got to be ready for combat, intense combat around the clock? And the reason I ask that is I've interviewed some Black Hawk Down veterans who are Army Rangers. And the one, they always talk about the peacetime Army. It's like we signed up, we were in the peacetime Army. We didn't really expect, Mogadishu to happen. And it did. For you, what was kind of that feeling like in 98?
Yeah, so my experience in Ranger Regiment is a lot different than a lot of guys would have found. Obviously, I run a podcast where I sit down and I ask guys the same thing, that you're asking right now about their time in the 75th Ranger Regiment. And it was not a good experience. And we were not focused on training. We weren't focused on war. And this is my platoon. There was other elements that I felt, other platoons, other companies and everything else were kind of different. But no, really, we weren't. And you couple that with the fact of, we're coming to the end of a Democratic president. Money was a huge issue. Like when I showed up, they were like, "Oh, hey, we spent pretty much all the fiscal year money already for like one rotation, one trip." So we just walked in the woods like all the time. Like, and we didn't even go to ranges. We didn't even have like blank ammo. The first real exercise was like 5 months after I got to regiment. We did a GRX down in Florida, and that was the first time like I actually had ammo. I actually loaded ammo. We jumped and we did all this different kind of stuff. And I was like, okay, this is a little bit different. This is actually what I joined the military to do, and especially a Ranger Regiment. And so part of it was my leadership, but also it was just a little bit of the times. But that morphed over time, not necessarily because of, hey, we think something's going to happen. Just honestly, it was just the leadership and the mentality that they had. We got some leaders after an event happened in my platoon that came from other elements within the battalion. And then even my platoon sergeant, he came from 175, and 175 was very different back then. And they changed our mentality. One of the, and I talk about him all the time. Josh Wheeler was my squad leader, and he was always pounding in our head, like, hey, every training, every time we do PT, every single thing that we do, we need to do it like it's the last time before we go to war. It wasn't because he had this premonition. It's just he knew that that was the job of the military. Like, we got to be prepared at all times. That's what we're supposed to do.
Well, and let's get into Josh Wheeler up front because you did
All
bring
right.
him up. Josh Wheeler, to the viewers, many of know who he is. He's a former Army Ranger, went to Delta Force, was killed in what is a very famous hostage rescue mission where Pat Payne won the Medal of Honor and Josh
Well,
KIA got the Silver Star. Could you tell our audience what your memories of just Josh as a human, Josh as a guy, like what was Josh Wheeler like?
Josh is probably one of the most influential people in my entire life as far as the military and being a man. There's a few other Bernie Felino and Chuck Albertson also are definitely up there, but Josh Wheeler was huge. And the reason is stuff that I already talked about. He came over to our platoon. He was my squad leader. Another great ranger, Casey Casmat, who was killed with Blackhawk when he was there. We were team leaders together. And our initial impression of Josh Wheeler was not good because he literally came into, at the time, we had a barracks room on the bottom floor. That's where all the NCOs were. And Casey and I shared a room. And Josh came in. I don't even remember. It was like 4:30 in the morning. Kicked open our door and said, "Team leaders are up before everybody else. What the hell are you guys doing in bed?" And I remember Casey. He leaned over. He like rolled over and he's like, I ain't gonna fucking make it with this dude. Like it's 4:30 in the goddamn morning. And anyway, we got up and